afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association, and today, as part of the Alumni Association's webinar series, we present Keeping Freedom Summer Alive. Joining us for today's webinar are Ian Polumbaum, Assistant District Attorney and son of Freedom Summer photographer Ted Polumbaum, Jacky Johnson, Miami University Archivist, and here to moderate the discussion is Jason Shaiman, Curator of Exhibitions at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum here at Miami. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here to share a little bit about Freedom Summer and the experience of working to preserve its legacy. Welcome. As a reminder to our live viewers, you can submit questions during the webinar using the Ask a Question button under your video. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian, Jacky, and Jason to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Molly, so much. It's a pleasure to be here with Jacky and Ian for this program in conjunction with the exhibition Through Their Lens, Photographing Freedom Summer. A little bit about our speakers. Jacky Johnson is currently the University Archivist and Principal Librarian at Miami University Libraries. Her research focuses on the history of Western College for Women, Oxford College for Women, and the Mississippi Summer Project. Johnson is the author of Finding Freedom, memorializing the voices of Freedom Summer through Miami University Press, along with Western History, printed by Arcadia Press. Her latest book chapter, titled Citizenship, Social Justice, and Arts-Based Dialogue Through the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project of 1964, will appear in the monograph Engaging Youth Civic Participation, Critical Approaches to Teaching Digital Media in Art Classrooms and Communities. Our other speaker is Ian Polumbaum, who was 7 months old in June of 1964 when his father, Ted Polumbaum, came to Oxford to photograph the Freedom Summer volunteer training for Time magazine, and then followed the group to Mississippi. Ian grew up immersed in words and images that conveyed the horrors and hopes of the time. He followed his father into journalism as managing editor of the UMass Amherst newspaper, and then a reporter in New Jersey and Vermont before going to law school. Since '98, Ian has worked as an assistant district attorney in Boston, prosecuting homicides, domestic and sexual violence, and crimes by police officers. So we are thrilled to be able to share this time with Jacky and Ian. And I believe Jacky will kick us off with some presentation, and then we will turn over to Ian with a couple preceding questions, and then some following questions for our two guest speakers. So if we could go ahead and start our presentation.
Good afternoon. So I'm Jacky Johnson, University Archivist at Miami University, and I'm going to talk about keeping freedom alive, the University Archives and Western College Memorial Archives. Next slide, please. Responsibility portraying historical events. The primary documents need to be authentic and about the event itself. The donors need to be aware of what will happen with the collections once it is donated. Will the collection be digitized? Will the collection be organized? Will the collection remain in the facility which it was given to? Will it be shared with another institution? Has the deed of gift been signed by the donors that give the institution permission to house and archive the collections? And has the archivist or myself fulfilled the promises that the deed of gifts has specified? Next slide, please. The history of Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was a project in the summer of 1964 with the purpose of supporting the voting rights of African Americans. Volunteers attempted to register residents in the state of Mississippi which had the lowest percentage of African American voters in the US. The project is also known as Freedom Summer. Now, many of the images you'll see in today's presentation are from the actual Western College Memorial Archives, which is within the library itself, within the University Archives collection. Next slide, please. Trainings at Western College. Approximately 700 volunteers trained at Western College for women in '64. They were sponsored by several different organizations, SNCC, the SCLC, the NAACP, and CORE. Next slide, please. Training sessions. Volunteers from across the United States were trained to do 4 things: work in community centers, teach in freedom schools, register African American residents to vote, and also they were trained in nonviolent resistance training. Next slide, please. The organization of the Miami University Archives. Well, there are 3 archives in one. There's the Miami University Archive, Western College Memorial Archives, and the Oxford Female Institute, which is also known as Oxford College. All these materials are housed under the Miami University Archives collection. Next slide, please. So, the collections are available through the digital archive. So we have about 30,000 documents, and there are all kinds of documents. There are letters, which you call correspondence, there are photographs, there are journals, audio recordings, video recordings, textual information. So we have a collection of text and also audio and video. So everything is really available through our online digital archive, and this is the cover of the splash page. Next slide, please. So we have an interesting collection because, we have all these documents about Freedom Summer, but within this big collection of documents, Freedom Summer, we have 3 first-person narrative stories. We have Carole Coca collection, the Roland Dirksen collection, and the Mark Levy collection. And I will tell you, we were so excited because in 2014, during the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, the observance of Freedom Summer, these 3 former volunteers donated their entire collection to the archive. Next slide, please. The first collection is Carole Rose Coca. Carole Coca was born in Davenport, Iowa. She was a graduate, or she is a graduate of the University of Iowa. She volunteered in Mississippi in several ways. She volunteered in freedom schools and community centers, and she donated her entire collection of materials, which is first-person narrative, to the archive itself in 2014. And so the images that you see here are from her collection. Next slide, please. The Roland Dirksen collection. Roland Dirksen he didn't volunteer in Mississippi, but he did go to Mississippi, and he did spend time teaching in freedom schools. He was a professor at Purdue University before coming to Miami eventually. It was so interesting because he didn't really volunteer, but he went to Mississippi, stayed the entire summer, came back to his work in Purdue, and 4 years later, he would get a job at Miami University. And so when in 2014, he once again donated his collection to the University Archives, or to the Western College Memorial Archives. Next slide, please. Mark Levy, this is the 3rd collection. Mark Levy is a graduate of Queens College. He's a native New Yorker, and he also donated his collection in 2014. His collection consists of oral histories, primary documents from his time in Mississippi, and this is a pretty interesting collection because it's kind of, we have his collection, but also it's shared with Queens College in New York. Next slide, please. Collection question. When a collection of materials is by a single person is offered to the archive, for example, the Freedom Summer Archives, what is considered? Well, there are several things that we consider. Are the materials primary documents? Do the materials relate to the historical event itself? What is the condition of the material, the collection? Who owns the material and copyright? And those are things that we should consider before we accept any collection, especially these type of historical collections. Next slide, please. Second collection question. How is an archive made available for research, publication, and lending? We don't allow materials to circulate, so we're library use only. So when we receive collections, we process them and make them available to researchers through our archive space instance, our open source content management system for archives, and through digitization. This will allow the next generation of users to learn about Freedom Summer through use of our primary documents that describe the events from first-person narratives. Next slide. And finally, thank you to the Ted Polumbaum collection, which was formerly housed at the museum in Washington, D.C. We have used this collection so many times in different projects that we're working on in Freedom Summer at Miami University. So thank you so much for the Ted Polumbaum family for their generosity and allowing us to use the materials in our work. And thank you.
It's a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about archiving at the university and how important it is for the history that took place here. Now, looking at the other side of this, for Ian Polumbaum, looking at archiving Freedom Summer, as well as other material from the photographer that was involved. So Ian, just a couple quick questions before you jump in. So how did your father end up in a position to witness history from behind the lens?
Yeah, everybody. Hope I can be heard okay. My dad ended up as a photographer, and more specifically, a photojournalist. I think it was a combination of happenstance and necessity. He went to college. He was a World War II veteran, went to college on the GI Bill, graduated in 1948. Classmate of George Bush. They did not hang out together. And went to work as a journalist, as a reporter. He worked for a wonderful small daily paper called the Gazette and Daily in York, Pennsylvania, and then moved to Boston, got a job as a TV news writer for Acme News Pictures, which then became part of United Press, which became UPI, the big wire service. And he was doing that in the early 1950s when his activities at college caught up to him, along with McCarthyism. He had been in something in college called the John Reed Club that basically brought leftist speakers to campus. Certainly something a lot less ominous than maybe the insurrectionists of today. But that was enough in the 50s to get him called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1953 in Washington. And the members of that congressional committee wanted him to name names, wanted him to talk about who else was in this harmless political group at Yale. And he told them to pound sand. He took the fifth to the questions and didn't answer the questions about who else was involved in these activities. And for that, United Press decided, even though they combed through his scripts and found, even by the standards of the day, no subversive bias in anything he wrote about the news, they still said he took a controversial stand. And therefore he couldn't be trusted to be objective, and they fired him, and he was blacklisted from the news writing business. Photography at that point had just been a hobby for him. He had a little Brownie camera he liked to snap pictures with, but he decided to try it as a way to make a living. And I'm not sure how exactly somebody connected him, but ironically, he ended up doing a lot of work for Life magazine. That was the biggest central part of his photojournalism career. The reason I say ironically is because Henry Luce, who ran the Time Life empire, was a very ardent, anti-communist reactionary, but he didn't subscribe to the blacklist. He didn't care if people could write and take good pictures, they could work for his publications. And that's what my dad ended up doing. And it ended up being a long career in photojournalism, magazine photography, some newspaper, some projects he did on his own, and later in life, commercial things, corporate annual reports and so on. Did a lot of celebrities, did a lot of politicians. I'll show you one in a moment, but he really was for the underdog and for the everyday folks, and finding the stories. And I think, Jason, you had another question about that in terms of finding the stories.
Yes, thanks, Ian. Did your father discuss his thoughts about photography, but perhaps more specifically, the differences between artistic photography and photojournalism?
I wouldn't say that he, articulated or orated about it. It was more what he practiced and what he obviously believed. You can look at a photograph and it can be a great artistic composition on his own, and many of his pictures were. But coming into it from journalism, he also came into it with the idea that every picture not just tells a story on its face, but has a story behind it. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes photography photojournalism, is when the photographer or somebody working with the photographer makes sure the picture comes accompanied by context. It could be a caption, it could be a story. And of course, Life magazine that he worked for was kind of, for a long time, it was the premier vehicle of that. There were pictures, and then there were context to the pictures, so that the image really, comes alive historically and emotionally and everything else. Mm-hmm. And I think he brought that to everything he did. So he didn't spend a lot of time talking about himself, like, look at me, look at what I do. Right. He did it, but I think he had pretty clear views about wanting a picture not just to stand on its own as a piece of art, but as something that had context and significance. Mm-hmm. If you see the first slide, for example, go ahead.
Yeah, if we can get that slideshow back up, Molly. There we are.
Okay. This,
thank you.
I mean, this is as famous as he got in his stuff. My dad, over the years, because the Kennedys are from Massachusetts, took a lot of Kennedy photos. And this one is 1961. This is Ted Kennedy when, for a few minutes, it seemed like he was an assistant district attorney in Boston. Same job I have now. So I guess he's a predecessor of mine. This is in front of the courthouse that I work in every day in Boston. And my dad enjoyed these things, and they had some historical significance, and a lot of well-known people, athletes, politicians, entertainers, you name it, but still wasn't where his heart was. His heart was with the underdogs and with the people doing significant work, and with the people doing significant things for social change. And of course, Ted Kennedy ended up being an extremely important figure. But I don't think being around, the famous people was what really gave my dad his satisfaction. 3 years after this picture was taken, the next slide shows Oxford, Ohio in 1964, June. And this, I think this was also this or one of the same pictures from the series is one of the ones that Jacky showed. Mm-hmm. This is part of the nonviolent resistance training. People from mostly college campuses all over the North and Northeast came to Oxford. It was the Western College for Women then. And they were addressed and trained by people from the major civil rights groups, including SNCC, including Council on Racial Equality. And one of the things they did, basically what you can see in this picture is there are people playing the part of hostile locals, possibly hostile local police officers. What do you do if somebody is screaming in your face? What do you do if somebody knocks you down and they're punching and kicking you and mobbing you? And as part of this training, obviously there was training about voter registration and how to go out and get people to sign up to vote, particularly Black people who were disenfranchised more in Mississippi than anywhere else. Teaching, setting up freedom schools, which actually taught some basic literacy and other things to kids who either had unequal schools or no schools. And also this part of it, letting people know this was dangerous. One of the things that my father said about that experience in the summer of 1964, and he wasn't out there doing the civil rights work, but he was chronicling it and following it. And at that time, to the people resistant to that change, the Northern establishment media were every bit as much the enemy. And my father said that nowhere else, not in the Pacific during World War II, and not anywhere else he had ever been, was he as scared as he was that summer. And they had people counsel the volunteers about, know the roads, don't travel them after dark. Nobody had cell phones, of course, back then. Have people know where you're leaving, where you're going, where you expect to end up. Don't trust people with or without a badge who are trying to tell you to do things. It was quite a terrifying time. And it was a terrifying time for the volunteers, and it quickly got more so. And looking at these pictures as we go along, you can go to the next slide, Molly, thank you. This is sometime shortly before the buses left Oxford after the training. There was also somebody, by the way, from the Attorney General's office. Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General, who came down basically to tell them, kids, you're doing great work, but we can't protect you. So you're on your own when you're out there. And in the face of all that, here's the volunteers in this picture. They're actually singing "We Shall Overcome" before the rest of them board those buses, and the buses headed south from Ohio to Mississippi as June got into July 1964. And when you talk about context, I mean, this is a nice picture of people singing. Looks like they're passionate and hopeful, but when you add the context and you see both the hope and the inspiration, and also in retrospect, the sadness and the dread, because that not only good is going to come to some of these folks as they go off to do their work, but off they went, as shown in the next picture. This is a volunteer in an older local resident's house. They went door to door, house to house, farm to farm, shack to shack, going over the paperwork for voter registration. People may recall, if you lived through it or recall from history, that states, southern states in particular, but not exclusively, the response to voting rights laws that said everybody could vote was to make it as hard as possible, especially for people of color. The forms were onerous. They had a lot of questions that really had nothing to do with whether somebody is qualified to cast a ballot. And there was the courage of people going to register voters, which was the enemy of people who didn't want that to happen. And then, next slide, there was the courage of people lining up in the heat outside the, I don't remember if it was a county building or a municipal building. This is Greenwood, Mississippi. July 16th, 1964 was called Freedom Day. And there were two things going on. One was people lining up in the heat to register to vote. And what the local officials would do, rather than illegally deny somebody a voter registration, is they just slow walk it or just close the office down. And I think by the end of however many hours all these people in line voted or waited to register, 6 people actually got into the clerk's office and were allowed to sign up. So there were the courage of people who were the civil rights workers going down to do this work. But then there were the people themselves who lived there. And the idea of them just casting a ballot was just unfathomably repugnant to people who didn't want them to have that right. And that's the amazing context for this picture. It's not just a bunch of older, well-dressed people waiting in a line. It's the significance is staggering when you think about it. Next slide. The other thing that happened on Freedom Day in Greenwood is there were demonstrations, people holding signs, people singing, people chanting, and people risking their safety just to stand up for those things. This gentleman in the picture is named Monroe Sharp. He's deceased now. He was, I think, a leader or the leader of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Chicago, and he in the mid-60s, and he also came down to Mississippi and was an organizer there. He was one of 111 people arrested, included 13 juveniles out of those people, and in the next slide, included at least one pregnant woman, somebody being dragged along the ground by a police officer, some passive resistance, I suppose, but being dragged to the bus and off to jail. As people know now, that summer became well known and infamous for what happened to 3 of the volunteers, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, Jacky Schwerner, and Cheney. They disappeared. They were arrested for speeding, brought to a police station, and then released. They were released basically by law enforcement who, in retrospect, it appears knew full well what was likely to happen to them. Released them to be followed along a dark rural road, and they were never seen alive again. Sometime after that, their car was found, and some weeks after that, their bodies were found. And they had been kidnapped and murdered by locals, members of the Ku Klux Klan, who included at least one member of law enforcement. It's that context, the post context. It wouldn't be on a photo caption from the day my dad took the pictures of all these things going on, but it's certainly the context that looms over all these pictures since. And my father was also there in Mississippi, covering it for Time magazine, not Life at this point. Life sent its own group of photographers there who were on staff. But he was there when they found the burned out cars. He was there when Rita Schwerner, who was married to Mickey Schwerner, insisted on getting information from the sheriff, who pretended to care and who, at her insistence, grudgingly let Rita Schwerner view the car in the garage where it had been towed. And that's the next and the final slide here. And again, a picture in itself, it's a nice black and white composition. It's artistic. but the context is really what makes this leap off the page in a different way, or leap off the screen, or leap off however you're looking at it. Once you know the story behind that car, behind Rita Schwerner, who was a volunteer along with her husband, once you know what else was found, meaning the body of her husband and the bodies of two others some weeks after this, it makes it so you can stare at this for hours. And again, that's something I guess I trumpet now about my father. I suppose it's what helped me get into journalism, maybe get into the public side of the law, trying to do the right thing. But he never talked about it that way. He never said, look at me, look at this awesome stuff that I do. He just did it. And when he talked about it, he kept a lot of the fear to himself, unless he was really asked. He didn't like to talk about himself. One of the great ironies, I started this slide deck with the picture of Ted Kennedy in 1961. 5 years after this picture was taken, my father was on assignment again. I don't remember whether it was Time or Life or maybe New York Times Magazine, but he drove the couple of hours down to the ferry and out to Martha's Vineyard to take a picture of an Oldsmobile being pulled out of the water. That was the car that Ted Kennedy was driving in when he went off the bridge at Chappaquiddick and caused the death of a passenger of his. Again, a big news event at the time. Turned out to be a major historical event because it probably prevented another Kennedy from becoming president. And again, my father didn't trumpet that, and I don't think he would have viewed that picture involving a world famous person as any more important than any of the thousands of pictures he took of factory workers or civil rights volunteers or anybody. And that, I think, Jason, you had a question about archiving things and how do we get to the point where his pictures are in collections and so on.
Yes. Thanks, Ian, for sharing and putting into perspective a lot of your father's photos and how they help with the Freedom Summer narrative. We learned so much about it. You mentioned briefly, the pictures tell, stories, and that was the main focus of what we were trying to do with the exhibition, was to tell the backstories of the photographers and their photos. So I appreciate you also recognizing the importance of the stories and not just what the pictures just represent on the surface. And so that must have played some role in the work that you, your sister Judy, your mother Nina had done in terms of archiving your father's photographic work. And, I'm curious also, I don't know that I ever asked you, was your father alive when the archiving project started? Did he have any contributions? And also, how long did archiving all of his photos take?
First of all, I can claim no credit for the archiving. That was really my mother and later my sister. My father died in 2001. He was 76 years old. And after he really did, the answer to how much did he do to archive or create a collection, the answer to that was none, in the sense that he never, just as he never trumpeted his work, beyond trying to hustle it and get assignments. I don't think I ever heard him talk about a legacy. I think he just let the pictures speak for themselves and the context speak for itself, I should say, the pictures and the captions and the stories and the backstories. He did, I mean, he kept his negatives and slides. Remember, this was back when everything was on negatives, and there was a dark room. It was first upstairs in the house I grew up in suburban Boston, and then in the basement of the house that we lived in Cambridge, Mass, from when I was in high school. He kept his negatives very well organized, the ones that he had. If you could read his writing, which sometimes even he couldn't. He had a doctor's handwriting. Time Life, of course, had custody, physical custody of pretty much all the pictures he ever took and sent off to them. And a lot of the way that would work is he would take the pictures and then have the film, mailed or sent by courier to Time or Life, and they would develop them, and he'd get contacts and they'd pick them out. So Time and Life had his negatives. They were good. This Time Incorporated, I guess, by the time he passed away, they were very good about sending them back. And, because they were the property of the photographer, ultimately, although Time Life had the rights to use whatever they had. The archiving came later, and that was really a function of my mother wanting the pictures to mean something and be available going forward. And she decided to donate them to the museum. This was back when the museum was new, and it was also an actual building, like a museum with stuff in it and people who go there. First in Virginia, across the river from DC, and then later in a beautiful building, which this was the last big piece of real estate along the mall in Washington. It didn't work out as a museum, partly because it wasn't free like the Smithsonian, and just the model of a museum that unfortunately cost a bit to visit. Didn't work for there. So the museum is now virtual, but the museum was an actual museum and archives offsite at the time that my mom donated the pictures. That consisted both of getting the negatives, organizing them, culling out things that were purely family, because you can imagine how much there was of that growing up in a photographer's family. Other things that had particular personal or family significance, trips and projects. We still have some of that stuff in the house. And some of the more significant things, such as these pictures from Freedom Summer, that I think my mother believed would be the most useful, the most in demand as well, were digitized. I think the total amount of pictures is between 250,000 and 300,000. Wow. Out of that, I think about 1%, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 were digitized. And this was, in the early going of a scanner. Everybody has a scanner now. You can use your phone, but there were these big things that fit on a desk. And my mom did a lot of it. My sister later did a lot of it. And my mom also had a helper come in, a student who came in and did a lot of that stuff. And then the Freedom Forum, which was kind of the parent organization of the museum, affiliated with Gannett, and a lot of Gannett money went into it, and my mom donated as well. That went into the exhibitions, both at the museum itself and the online things that have cropped up that it's not the same as looking at it on a wall, but it reaches an awful lot more people, and we can do things like this. Mm-hmm. So again, the archiving came later. I can't claim any credit myself for doing that work. It's all my mother, who's 100 now, and my sister, older sister. All I've done is kind of absorbed it during my life, and then gone back and done some homework so I could try to speak intelligently about it today.
Oh, definitely. We greatly appreciate it. We're very pleased to work with Freedom Forum in acquiring the rights to have photos printed for inclusion in this exhibition that we have. And so we're grateful for all that work. We're also grateful for you, your mother, and your sister who had been part of the background research for the exhibition. I remember having Zoom conversations with the two of them, with one of my interns, and it was a great opportunity to learn more about your father's work, but what went into preserving, the archive of your father's work. If Jacky is able to come back on, there you are.
Hello, how are you?
So, Jacky, question for you, in relation to all of this work with Freedom Summer, and you began also as the archivist of the Freedom Summer material. So you are so intimate with the history, with so many of the photos and the documents. And I appreciated how much you acknowledged the Polumbaum family and museum in your earlier presentation. But a big question that I have is, how often is the Freedom Summer Archive at Miami requested for study and use?
Well, I would say it's
who's,
every day.
and who's really the one? Who were the people that are requesting use of the collection?
Well, I think it's being requested every day, and I think because it's digital, we have people from around the world using the collection. So, but what I wanted to do was, if Molly's available, I wanted to put some information more about the collection itself on slide deck 12. Molly, could you go back to that, or Jason? I wanted to read a letter because I talked about Carole Gross-Kolka. She was one of the volunteers, and she gave us her entire collection of Freedom Summer materials, which is the first-person narrative. Now, this letter, often we look at these things, these materials, and we think, well, this is a letter. It talks about the time. This was a traumatic experience for people. Her parents received hate mail. We often think that Freedom Summer and these things should be talked about as history. But what archivists do, we bring the history to the present day. And this is a letter, and we talked about bringing photographs to life. I want to bring this letter to life. I want you to know what she experienced along with her family. This letter is dated September the 21st, 1964. It says, "Dear friends, here is a fable which may interest you. Once upon a time, in the fall, a stupid blackbird tried to fly south with the robins. He soon discovered that he must either leave the flock or be pecked to death. Like those very few black people who try to force themselves upon the whites, he too was too stupid to know that birds of a feather like to flock together. Some people try to make cats and dogs live together. They are not bright enough to see that the result will not be integration. The result will be a cat and dog fight. Some people try to mix Negroes and white people live together. They are not bright enough to see that the result will not be integration. The result will be race riots."
Wow.
Now, that's the letter that her parents received.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we talk about as an archivist, this is domestic terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
People were threatened. They were murdered. They were beaten by dogs, attacked with water hoses, all because people did not want African Americans to have the right to vote.
Yeah.
It's our responsibility as educators to continue to make this information available. And it's so important to me as an archivist because I'm using primary documents.
Right.
There are some people who were teaching that the civil rights movement it wasn't realistic. It really didn't occur. So what we do, we use the power of history. We say we have this letter from 64, this, okay, and this is a realistic letter. It's not fake, it's not phony. And we use history to explain the past and also to make sure that we don't make the mistake of repeating the past, right? So that's why I think this letter is an example of what we teach people.
Mm-hmm.
And how people can have access to the materials that we talk about and that we teach.
I think that's so important, especially for students today. And I'm sure that, students are part of those who are using the Freedom Summer Archive.
Students, faculty, staff, people around the world, anybody who wants to learn about freedom and voting rights,
Mm-hmm.
this collection is available for you.
Fantastic. I mean, it's, the importance of making, as you said, making this material accessible and getting out. Part of it is going back to the title of this presentation is keeping Freedom Summer alive.
Right.
And much of it is through the use of the archives, whether it's documents or photos like Ted Polumbaum's photos. And just even having opportunities for a program like this to be able to keep these stories going. And there's always new things that come out every single time. And I think that's important for the extending the story, the narrative, keeping it alive, for all intents and purposes, keeping it fresh so it's not reiterating the same stories. And I'm sure, Ian, you probably experienced a lot of that, just working with the archive with your family. Oh, I think you might.
Like I said, I did. Like I said, I can't take credit for actually doing the archiving work, but I've certainly been around the stuff, and sometimes I see something that I forgot about. I wanted to ask Jacky, is that letter signed or anonymous?
It's signed Race Riots. So it's anonymous.
Yeah. I mean, that's an example of, because history is made, we've talked about ordinary people being heroes. Those people standing in line to vote. What really grabs you about that, thinking about it, is that letter and the hate behind it. That was all brought on by the idea that those people standing in line to vote, like the offensive idea was that those people standing in line could vote.
Right.
And it's also, that was, makes you think, who wrote that letter? Who are they? It's some everyday person who they're communicating what they know and what they grew up with. And probably nobody ever told them there was anything wrong with it.
No, but I think the most important thing, I guess, is because of the time we live in today, we have people like Jason Shaiman, right? People who refuse to allow hatred and bigotry to be taught. So we use these letters and documents and archival material to help dispel and to wipe out racism. And that's the power of archives and art museums, where we collect.
Mm-hmm.
How we really, it's free. You ever notice everything we do is free?
Yeah.
Okay, because we want people to use the materials.
Absolutely.
And so, someone has to have the bravery to do the work. Mm-hmm. Someone has to be committed to making sure that we teach about what we in the history, but also the present. And Ted Polumbaum, Carole Coca, Mark Levy, Roland Dirksen, they experienced it. They were brave enough to keep the documents and allow us to share, to teach people, the next generation of freedom fighters. And that's what these collections do. We are training people how to be brave and how to speak up and not to remain silent.
Well said, Jacky. Absolutely. Ian, just another quick question. Did your father ever experience or was ever in a position where he feared that he would have been harmed while he was in Mississippi? Or do you think that him being there on assignment for time, maybe he was wearing a press badge that perhaps protected him in some way?
I don't think he felt like it protected him very much. And people also cautioned him, don't be out there alone. He did take refuge in houses a couple of times. He did feel like he was followed a couple of times. I mean, like I said, unfortunately, we're hearing kind of echoes of that these days with the media being enemies of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really what, I mean, a lot of the most hateful people confronting the voting rights workers and the aspiring voters, they viewed the news media as just as bad or even worse, because shining a light on something is not what people want.
No.
He did. He didn't get physically harmed there, but it was ever present.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he thought of himself as, any braver than anybody else. And that's why I tried to emphasize, like, there's the bravery of the workers and everything. How about the people who are just standing in line?
Yes, absolutely. And those kinds of stories that are documented, that are in these archives, is really what people need to read and see to really understand the gravity of that summer.
Yeah, and the gravity of the importance of voting.
Yes.
People have died to vote.
Yes.
People have been threatened.
Mm-hmm.
They've lost their lives, right? So this is serious.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it was documented when they were looking for James Chaney and Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, that they found, I believe, 8 other Black men who were basically forgotten, or at least not by their families and not by their communities, but as Ian said, hoping that, wouldn't shed light on those situations. And when it did come to light, it was something hard to put back in the shadows, and it became ever present.
That's right.
Well, this is absolutely phenomenal with both of you. Curious, Molly, if there are any questions by any of our guests.
Let's see. I do have a note of thanks from Judith, who certainly in this time, given that we're, a stone's throw from our next presidential election, and sharing your dad's work and the importance of voting and everyone having the same opportunity to cast their votes, how important that is to remember. So I think this is a really great time to have shared this story. And I also think that it is just really important that people remember this is not ancient history. That letter was written less than 20 years before I was born, and I am not that old. So I feel like that is an important perspective to keep top of mind, is that this was practically yesterday, and, we can't go back there ever again. So, while historical, it's not that far from us. So we still have some work to do. And I'm so pleased and appreciative that you all could be here with us to sort of underscore the value of these stories and the importance of digitizing them to, be sure that we can keep sharing them as far and wide as we can, because they are obviously tremendously important, particularly even in our current narrative of this country. So thank you all so much for joining us and bringing this to us. Yeah. Really appreciate it. If there are no final thoughts,
I have a final.
Oh, please do, Jacky.
Yeah, I have a final quote I like to share to motivate us.
Yes.
From Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. We have to keep moving forward and motivating ourselves. And always do the right thing as archivists and researchers.
Yeah.
And just everyday citizens.
And we see that when we have student groups coming in to see the exhibition, and we have classes coming in.
Keep doing the work.
I'm always charging the students with they have the responsibility to vote, because so many people laid their lives on the line and made sacrifices. Don't take it for granted.
No.
And we learn about these through these photos. We learn about through the archives. And I have no doubt there are thousands of other photos and stories that are out there that haven't been shared with the public. So imagine what else can be added to the narrative.
Well, while I was on here, a text popped up from my daughter saying she just sent her absentee ballot from college. So
fantastic. And I remind students of that. If you can't get home, get that absentee ballot submitted.
There's still plenty of time. You still got plenty of time.
And I always tell the students, I said, I don't care who you're voting for, vote. Because if you don't vote, you cannot say anything.
There you go.
You don't have a leg to stand on.
That's right.
And that's what these people associated with Freedom Summer, they were giving the people in Mississippi the legs to stand on by helping them. Don't lose that importance.
Absolutely.
Everybody.
Well, thank you all so very much. I would be remiss if I did not mention that you can see this exhibition, this Freedom Summer exhibition featuring Ian's father, Ted's photographs. You can see that now. From now, through December 14th, I believe, at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum here on campus. Of course, the archives are available to those who are interested in taking a look and learning from them, because we will not let Jacky's hard work go to waste here. This is tremendously important. So go take a look at all the stuff we have to offer. And of course, as a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website later today at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Get out and vote. Love and honor to you. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Jacky, Ian, and Molly. Thank you so much.
Okay, great.